The scorching sun blazed over Redemption Gulch, turning the cracked earth into a furnace and lifting fine red dust that clung to skin and fabric alike. Vincent rode into town, his silhouette framed by the shimmer of heat rising off the ground. The groan of his saddle and the occasional bellow of distant cattle were the only familiar sounds in an otherwise tense atmosphere. This wasn't a casual visit. He had come for the auction, a grim tradition of frontier survival where luck and loss exchanged hands with frightening speed. The air buzzed with the sense of perspiration, worn leather, horses, and quiet desperation. Vincent, a man sculpted by long days beneath open skies and the hard demands of ranch life, carried the dust of his land on his clothes and the weight of solitude in his eyes. He wasn't one to linger or mingle, but today, something caught his attention. A lone figure tucked into the corner of the auction pen. A woman, her clothing burned and hanging in tatters, was cloaked in soot and silence, while others shifted nervously or muttered under their breath. She sat still, almost statue-like, her presence drawing murmurs. "Survivor from Devil's Creek," someone whispered, "lost everything in the fire." Despite her ruined state, there was something unyielding in her posture, dignity, perhaps, or some fragment of defiance refusing to be buried beneath ash. The auctioneer, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel dragged across metal, began his chant. The offers were low, thrown out by men hoping to snag a workhand with no thought to the humanity behind the soot. Just as the gavel hovered, seconds from falling, Vincent raised his hand. $50, he said, his voice sharp and firm. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. It was an outrageous price for a burned stranger with nothing but a name no one yet knew. The gavel dropped with a thunderous thud. She was as now dot as the woman was brought to him. Her steps were cautious, unsure. Midway, she faltered and looked up through the grime. Her eyes, an extraordinary shade of blue, met his. They were heavy with grief, but within them flickered something alive, something that had survived the fire. In that fleeting connection, words were unnecessary. There was something deeper exchanged, an understanding. This wasn't a mere deal. It felt like the first thread of something not yet named. He helped her into his wagon. They rode back toward his ranch as the sun began to sink. Bleeding oranges and purples across the wide, open sky. Silence hung between them, not awkward, but tentative, like a conversation waiting for the right moment to begin. Vincent glanced at her from time to time, wondering what story lay beneath the ash and the quiet. Back at the ranch, days fell into a rhythm, tentative but steady. The wide, empty land that surrounded the home seemed a reflection of Vincent himself, silent, steady, and vast. She spoke little, and he asked little in return. Her name, he'd learned from the station master, was Sarah. She moved through the house with a gentle purpose, cleaning thoroughly, cooking hearty meals, caring for the chickens with a practiced tenderness. The ash still clung to her skin, as if she wasn't ready to let the world see who she truly was. Vincent understood that instinct. Pain, after all, often preferred its mask. He left early each day to work the cattle, returning with the sun low and the light golden. From afar, he watched her pause during chores, eyes drifting toward the distant peaks, as if searching for something she'd lost or someplace that still called her name. Then, one evening, after hours of sweat and dust spent wrestling calves under the brutal sun, Vincent returned and found her at the wash basin outside the cabin. She stood alone, sleeves rolled up, carefully scrubbing her face, layer by layer. The soot melted away under her fingers. He paused, captivated, watching the transformation unfold, not just of her face, but of something deeper. The woman behind the ash was slowly beginning to reveal herself. The ash gave way slowly, unveiling skin pale and unmarred beneath the soot, cheekbones carved in delicate symmetry. Near her temple, just above her left brow, a faint network of scars became visible, subtle reminders of an ordeal endured. As the last traces of ash disappeared, she turned toward him. Her eyes, once clouded, were now a piercing blue, clear, steady, and full of quiet resolve, though not without their vulnerability. Those scars didn't scream tragedy, but whispered it. They spoke of flames and anguish, but her expression was calm, eyes steady and direct. That evening, as the smell of pine smoke drifted through the modest kitchen, They sat together for a humble meal, venison stew, steaming and simple. The silence between them had shifted. It no longer felt heavy or uncertain. Instead, it carried the weight of mutual understanding. Her voice, still rough from long silence, eventually broke through the quiet. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. She told him about a small home near a stream, about warmth, laughter, and love. Then, without build-up, she mentioned the fire, how it consumed everything that mattered. Her tone held no self-pity, only deep, bone-deep fatigue. Vincent listened without interrupting, his own solitude echoing in her words, but more than that, a deepening admiration for the strength she bore in silence. What had begun as a flicker of connection during the auction was now taking root, growing into something real, delicate, yes, but undeniably strong. The lonely vastness of Vincent's ranch didn't feel quite so hollow anymore. As days became weeks and weeks melted into months, a quiet transformation overtook the land and the life he had carved there. The ranch, once a place of quiet toil and isolation, began to breathe again with shared effort, shared purpose. Summer's blistering heat softened into the crisp clarity of fall. The cottonwoods along the creek lit up in golden flame, and Sarah, no longer cloaked in the remnants of fire and silence, came alive in ways Vincent hadn't anticipated. Where once she moved with guarded caution, now there was intention. She learned to ride her movements stiff but driven. She repaired shirts and fences alike. Her hands deft and sure, she stood beside him during cattle branding, unflinching. In the face of heat and chaos, her presence had become something grounding, something constant. The sky overhead, once a canvas of his loneliness, now seemed vast with the promise of shared dreams. Their conversations stretched into deeper waters, drifting from ranch chores to personal hopes and fears. Vincent spoke of growing his herd, of storms that threatened crops, of the gnawing emptiness he had grown used to. Sarah shared more of her own history, not to evoke sympathy, but to offer truth. There was a strength in her, hard-earned and worn with grace, that drew him in. He saw beyond her past, beyond the scars. He saw a woman forged in fire and still standing tall. One wind-whipped afternoon, while repairing a distant fence line, a sudden thunderstorm broke loose. Rain slashed across the plains, lightning split the sky, and the cattle panicked, bolting in a wild stampede. Vincent's heart clenched. He felt helpless, the old, familiar edge of despair creeping in. But then, Sarah's hand touched his arm, firm and steady. She didn't waver, moving quickly. She helped corral the panicked herd, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through, but her focus unshaken. They worked as one. When the last steer was secured, breathless and drenched, Vincent looked at her with new clarity. She wasn't just someone who'd entered his life by chance. She wasn't merely a survivor. She was his equal, his partner, his anchor in a world that so often felt like shifting sand. Whatever had passed between them unspoken was now solidified, real, unbreakable. But just as the rhythm of peace began to settle into the ranch, a dark ripple from Sarah's past threatened to break through. It started subtly, stray words. Overheard. In Redemption Gulch, a stranger had arrived, a man named Silas. He bore a vicious scar on his left cheek and the kind of stare that chilled blood. He wasn't just passing through, he was asking questions. Too many. He asked about a fire, about a lost family, about a lone woman who had made it out alive. Vincent heard the whispers in the general store, the sudden hush when he stepped inside. Silas wasn't a stranger to Sarah's story. He was once tied to her late husband, a man known for dealings that left no one clean. Violence clung to Silas like a shadow, and as Vincent rode back toward the ranch beneath the weight of the high summer sun, a new kind of unease settled into his bones. The past wasn't done with them yet. Supplies were holding out, but an unshakable tension had begun to take root. Sarah grew increasingly distant, her face marked by a fear Vincent had never seen in her before, so unlike the calm strength she usually radiated. One quiet evening, she confided in him, her voice barely above a breath. Silas, she said, had once been mixed up in her late husband's questionable affairs, and now he was convinced she knew the whereabouts of some hidden money. The atmosphere on the ranch thickened with silent anxiety, the kind that loomed like a coming storm not written in the sky. Then, one day, Silas appeared on their land, flanked by two men whose hardened eyes and weathered faces told stories of violence. His intent was unmistakable. He confronted Sarah directly, his words dripping with threat and implication. He demanded what he claimed was his share money he insisted she was hiding. With a sickening grin, he hinted at long-buried secrets, promising to ruin her life if she didn't cooperate. The moment was laced with danger. The air between Silas's cold taunts and Vincent's silent glare grew dense, brittle. Vincent wasn't a violent man, but something inside him shifted. His fingers hovered near the worn handle of his pistol, not from impulse, but from conviction. Sarah stood beside him, shaking yet unyielding. Her voice, though trembling, carried a firmness that surprised even her. She told Silas no, the ghosts she thought she'd left behind had clawed their way back into her life. But she wasn't going to run anymore. Vincent understood then, more deeply than ever, what it meant to love her. He would face whatever came, stand against whoever threatened her because she was his, and she mattered more than anything. Inside him, fear wrestled with determination. He feared what Silas might do, what it might cost them both. But Sarah's eyes, though touched by old pain, reflected a brave defiance. The quiet life they had worked to build was now hanging in the balance. A few days later, on a day when the wind swept across the land like an omen, Silas returned, this time with 3 rough men. The sun was low, casting strange, stretched shadows as the wind churned up dust around their boots. The very earth seemed to bristle. Vincent stood at the edge of their porch, steady, unshaken. He wasn't trained for gunfights, but he was ready to defend his home and the woman who had become his whole world. Sarah stood beside him again. She didn't hide. Her presence was bold, unflinching, a reflection of the deep trust she placed in him and the strength she had found in herself. The standoff crackled with tension. No one moved, but every breath felt like the precursor to violence. Silas stepped forward, hand inching toward his weapon, eyes narrowed and full of threat. The silence was a scream waiting to be unleashed. Then, from the distance, came the sound of hooves. 2 local ranchers rode in, men who knew the stories, who had seen Silas's bullying firsthand, and who had come not with curiosity but with purpose. They said little, but their presence alone shifted the dynamic. Silas's sneer faltered. His men looked around uneasily, outnumbered, and realizing that the moment he'd tried to dominate had slipped away from him, Silas backed down, muttering threats that dissolved into the wind. He and his gang rode off. What followed wasn't just relief, it was something deeper. As the danger passed, Vincent and Sarah stood there, the wind now gentler, brushing against them like a sigh. The fear had faded, but what remained was something unbreakable. They had faced down darkness together and come through stronger, more connected than ever before. As the final light of the sun bathed the sky in streaks of deep orange and violet, Vincent turned to Sarah. He didn't have to ask anything. Her tear-brimmed eyes and soft, unwavering smile gave him all the answers he needed. 1 week later, they exchanged vows on their land. It wasn't a grand event, just a few neighbors, open sky, and the truth of their love etched into every moment. No elaborate decorations, no formal promises, just the quiet certainty of 2 souls who had chosen each other through fire and fear and found peace in each other's arms. The solitary rancher and the woman who had carried hidden pain behind blue eyes had carved out a future, one built on shared burdens, mutual respect, and a love forged not in comfort, but in courage.